How's it going, everyone? My name is Bryce Newberger, and welcome to the first week of Addiction and Abuse. What we're going to talk about this week is identifying abuse and addiction and how they correlate to one another in ways that we've been abused. Now, let me call out the elephant in the room here. Nobody likes to be a victim. Well, I guess that's not true. Some people like to be a victim, but for the most of us, we don't like being a victim. The word abuse makes us cringe to think I've been abused. I've talked to a lot of men specifically who also, they're very uncomfortable with the concept of having been abused. They want to be big, strong men. They don't want to have been abused. But what happens is when we try to play the hero or play big, tough, and strong, we haven't been abused, nothing wrong has happened to us, we give room for things to grow and fester in the dark. As we sweep that under the rug, it grows mold. And when this is given birth fully to death, as scripture would put it, it can destroy our lives. And that's why we can go from being a pretty decent person to having an unspeakable moral failure. And that's why we want to address these things before that happens. So if you're here and you struggle with addiction, then this is the right place for you. But if you're here and you think, I'm not an addict, I don't struggle with addiction, there's nothing wrong with me, that's okay, because this is really a lesson for everyone, and everyone should go through this training to keep large forms of addiction and moral failures out of their lives. So this week, well, let's just start from a bird's eye view, and let's talk about, what do you think when you hear the word abuse? What do you think when you hear the word abuse? What I'd like to do is I'd like to go around the circle and have everyone introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe your name and just something you find interesting. Have a little icebreaker here, and then respond about what you think when you hear the word abuse, just in general. What we can do is we can pause the video here. You can go around your small group and have a little bit of a discussion, and we'll meet back here in just a few minutes. All right, hopefully you guys had a great circle of discussion. Hopefully everyone knows each other's names. There's one guy in here who is really nervous because he's not good with names. And he's like, everyone just told me their name. They expect me to know it, and I don't remember a single one of them. I know who you are because I've been you too. But either way, we've gone around, we've talked about what we think about the word abuse. And now let's take some time to actually talk about what abuse really is. Abuse has actually four main forms, and that's going to be emotional, physical, sexual, and spiritual. Now, most of us are probably very aware of sexual abuse and physical abuse, but emotional and spiritual might be a little bit harder to comprehend. Let me basically qualify what is abuse really in all of these forms, and I can equip you with ways to point out abuse. And remember, even if it's not a large abuse, it might be a small abuse, but anytime we are outside the will of God, we are going to give birth to a tiny abuse. And that little abuse, if left unchecked, can create in us great swaths of destruction if it's given legs. So first of all, we'll talk about abuse. The spectrum of abuse is going to go from essentially invasion to neglect. So invasion is when someone oversteps a God-given boundary that they should not be. I see this with, I've been a youth pastor, and I saw this with some of my students who, let's talk about emotional invasion, right? Emotional abuse in the form of invasion. I had students who were very well put together, very intelligent, very smart, very responsible. And when you looked at their family, someone in the family was not doing well. And so I saw one situation where a mother was coming to her daughter and crying on her shoulder and having essentially mental breakdowns in front of her daughter. I'm not here to condemn anyone, but what this created was the daughter became a shoulder to cry on, and she became the parent of the mother in that situation. And that's not really the designed order of things. The mother really shouldn't have done that to the daughter, and it created an abuse. It created an emotional abuse of invasion. There's another situation where I knew of a guy who was the first one in his family to graduate high school. He was going into college. He was so proud of himself, and no one really showed up, but his dad is driving him home from his graduation, and he's just talking about the future. He's on cloud nine. He's so excited, and then halfway home, his dad is silent, and finally the dad just says, $5. I'll give you $5 if you just shut up and stop talking. And what that created was neglect. His son was expressing his emotions, and the father was like, I'm not a safe place for you to share your emotions. In fact, you're annoying me. And that created an abuse in the form of neglect. And so there's a spectrum of abuse with, again, emotional, physical, sexual, and spiritual. Whenever we are not within the God-given boundary of appropriate behavior or contact or whatever the case may be, then we have an abuse. And wherever that abuse is, that becomes abuse. And so this is the spectrum of abuse. So what I'd like you guys to do is go around and talk about, ask the question, do you think you've been abused? Now, I get it. It's the first week. We just learned each other's names, and that guy can't remember anyone's name. So let's just have a little bit of grace, and don't really, if you're the leader of the group, don't necessarily call on people. Just let people go around, and if you don't want to talk about your own abuse, just keep it more general. Talk about ways that people could have been abused around you, or maybe some abuse you've seen, now being aware of the spectrum of abuse. We'll pause the video here while you guys talk. Hopefully you guys have had a great discussion about abuse and the spectrum of abuse and what that looks like in your lives. Next, we want to talk about addiction. So, what do you guys think about when you hear the word addiction? Me personally, I would think like alcohol and drugs and maybe pornography. But what do you guys think about when you hear the word addiction? Let's pause the video here, go around the group, and talk amongst yourselves, going each one. What do you think about the word addiction? All right, hopefully you guys have had a great conversation about the general concept of addiction. But now let's get into the nitty-gritty of what addiction really is. And so addiction comes in a myriad of forms. Here's some of the main forms of addiction. There's codependency. This is where we see people so reliant on relationships that they go from one to another to another. This is a feeling of need and reliance on a specific person. And so this could be a parent, this can be a sibling, this could be, a romantic interest, but whatever the case may be, you find that you feel an overwhelming need and reliance upon that person. You cannot survive without your mom, without your loved one, without your brother, or whatever the case may be. And this can seem really endearing, but the truth is you need to be able to be sustainable on yourself, between you and God. And so if you need nothing but the love of Christ. And so if you're feeling a sense of codependency on those around you, it's not that you should be fine without them. I don't care if I never see my wife again. That's not what we're going for here. But is there an over-reliance upon these things? And so, for example, abuse can lead to addiction. And how that might be is, let's talk about the spectrum of abuse. Let's say that son who reached out to his father, and his father was never there for him. His father didn't want to hear it. And so this was abuse from his father, emotional abuse from his father. Well, this man goes on and gets a job and finds a best friend in the workplace. And this friend actually has an inclined ear. He'll listen to him. Well, he begins to tell this person everything about his life. The person begins to listen and is a genuinely good friend. But then, because now he's having a deep-seated need met that's never been met before, he develops a sense of codependency on the person. When they don't show up to work, he has a horrible day at work because his friend didn't show up, right? And so this can be a minor or even an aggressive form of addiction. There's fantasy and preoccupation. Someone who has struggled with, let's say, intense physical abuse might, in the case of being physically struck or whatever, then they could fulfill their mind with fantasy or preoccupation with another story, another reality, whatever the case may be. Now, I have written a fantasy novel. I really enjoyed writing it. I enjoy fantasy, and I've definitely been guilty of this, where I will just get lost in a nerdy game or a nerdy video game or writing a story or whatever the case may be, and I'll just lose hours to this, and that's how I'll get through the day at work or whatever. And I'm not grounded in the moment, and so you become addicted to fantasy. And what happens is you start neglecting you begin to neglect things around the house. You neglect your spouse, you neglect your loved ones, you neglect your work. And that form of neglect is, again, a version of abuse. And so now you perpetuate abuse on your children, your loved ones, your family, because now you're neglecting them because you're busy being addicted to fantasy or preoccupation. You can establish certain habits that are not good. Do you find yourself doing certain patterns that lead to failure, moral failure, or acting out? Do you establish certain habits that are bad habits, or are there certain habits that you have created as a coping mechanism for some of the abuse in your life? Are you addicted to acting out in general? Some people are addicted to, let's say, going to the bar and getting drunk. And so they can blame other people for their reason of acting out. My wife yelled at me. I will go to the bar and drink 18,000 beers because of her. It's her fault. And so you can become addicted and making excuses to acting out. And the reality is, no, you are responsible for your own behaviors. Even if someone is very aggressively abusing you, it still doesn't give you the right to act out. And now we have grace, we have love for people. And so if you think, oh, well, this man's obviously doing this because of the extreme physical abuse he's suffering, you can have a heart for that, but the bottom line is that still sin yields death. And so even if you feel justified, it's still going to hurt you. It's poison you're drinking. In this case, quite literally, but metaphorically, it's poison you're drinking, and you don't want to do it. You want to resist it, no matter how justified you feel you are. And then there's despair. Some people can become addicted to despair. They're so used to being in the dark, they don't want to look up. They are nihilistic, and they prefer to think that there is no hope, and they've been pushed down so many times before that why even stand up again? And so there's many forms of addiction, but these are a few that I have dealt with that are very personal to me. What I would like you guys to do this week is we're going to pause the video here in a moment so you guys can continue to talk about these things. But for now, let me introduce the homework. When you go home, and throughout the week until we meet next week, journal or think freely. But basically, it'd be better if you were to get like a piece of paper, or you can do this on your phone, and you write down emotional, physical, sexual, and spiritual, right? So write down, I didn't have room in my little slide here, but write down the 4 categories, and then the subcategories are invasion and abandonment. It's a little tiny spectrum, and you can write invasion, abandonment, and you can even put it in between the two if it was a little bit in the middle. But you can write down different ways that you've been abused, and then continually to free journal on this. Think about ways that you have perhaps given way to addiction through those abuses. So guys, I hope you've had a great discussion today. Go ahead and take some time to talk amongst yourselves and talk freely about the various forms of abuse and addiction that you've seen in your lives, you've seen in others, and then create some time to pray for one another as we go on. The next few weeks will be very difficult, as next week we're going to talk about partnering together on this journey of healing. And so got a few rough weeks ahead, so definitely get in those prayer groups, rely on one another, lean on one another, and then have a great discussion. All right, I've been Bryce Newberger. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.